At a former assignment, I received a call one day to take communion to an elderly Italian parishioner. When I arrived at his house on a beautiful July day just like this one, I kind of noticed that his house and the neighbor's house, they were only about 10 feet apart, kind of close. Anyway, I walked up on his porch, I rang the doorbell, and he came out, and since it was such a nice day, he had this swing on his porch, and he said to me, let's just swing together on the swing, and we could have conversation. So we did that. And we're swinging back and forth, enjoying this beautiful July day, and having a nice conversation. Then all of a sudden, his neighbor walks out on his porch, and they look at each other, and they start yelling and ranting and raving at each other in Italian. I have no idea what they were saying, but I recognized many of those words. They were the same words my Italian grandfather would use when he was angry and upset about something. I had no idea what they were saying, but I knew it wasn't good. After about 10 minutes, literally at yelling at each other, the neighbor went in his house. And I was able to calm this man down. I said to him, what's going on? What happened? And he told me, and I kept saying to him in English, calm down, take a breather. And he told me about a fight he had with that neighbor. The fight was so bad that they had to call the police. And I said to him, when did this happen? Last night, last week? I didn't hear about any fight. These kind of things I usually hear about. And he looked at me and said, no. It happened in 1934 in Abruzzo, Italy. I said to the guy, I find a couple things amazing. You mean to tell me you two have been fighting since 1934? And he said to me, yeah, he's a no good. And then I said to him, what's really amazing is the fact that you two were neighbors in Italy. That part's not amazing. You were neighbors in Italy. But you both came to the United States 6,000 miles away. How did you become neighbors for the second time? This is a big country, the United States. You wind up being neighbors. Your houses are 10 feet apart. How did that happen? Well, it turned out to be a year later, the neighbor who came out on his porch, he died. And 4 days after that, the guy who was given communion to, he died 4 days after his neighbor died. Now, I think he died of a broken heart. They claimed they couldn't stand each other, but actually they needed each other. Every day they would look for each other so they could yell and say something in Italian at each other. They were neighbors that actually needed each other. And that's really a very interesting key point of today's gospel reading. The gospel comes out of the 10th chapter of Luke, verses 25 to 37. Now what we want to take a look at is verse 26. Let's take a look at verse 26. It says this. Jesus said in reply, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. So when you're looking at verse 26, there are a whole lot of messages we could develop right there in verse 26. But what happens in gospel readings, if Jesus wants us to focus on one idea, he usually repeats the same word several times right after he uses this word one time. So let's take a look at verse 29. Now I got verse 29, the 10th chapter of Luke on the top, and we repeat verse 26 to 10th chapter of Luke from about a third of the way down. Let's just go to the very top, verse 29. It says, a scholar of the law said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Now what I want you to do is this, just take a few moments to see it in verse 29, if there's a word in verse 29 that also exists in verse 26, and if you find such a word, that's going to be the message for tonight. Take a look at those two verses. Do you see a word that exists in both verse 29 and verse 26? You see it? What is the word? Neighbor. So what Jesus Christ is talking about is how do we treat our neighbors? Now, I'm just going to recap the gospel reading. In the gospel reading, a man falls to robbers. And these robbers, they strip this man, beat this man, leaving him half dead. A priest sees this man and he walks past the man on the opposite side of the street. A Levite does the same thing. But a Samaritan sees the man and he takes care of him. And the gospel reading ends with a very powerful question. It's in verse 36. Let's take a look what verse 36 has to say. And verse 36 asks the question, which of these three, that's the priest, the Levite, the Samaritan, in your opinion, was neighbor to the man who fell in with the robbers? Was it the priest? Clearly not. He helped him. Not at all. Was it the Levite, which is another category of priests in the Old Testament? No, it wasn't the Levite. It was the Samaritan. Take a look at verse 37. And there's the answer. The one who treated him with compassion, the Samaritan, Jesus said, then go and do the same. That's how we are to treat our neighbors. Now, you might be sitting there this evening and say to yourself, guess what, Father Ken? I live on 10 acres. I don't have a neighbor. Hallelujah. No neighbors. But what I did is I went to Webster's dictionary. I still use the dictionary by book, not on the internet. But I went to Webster's dictionary to find a concise meaning of the word neighbor. And this is the meaning of the word neighbor. Let's check this out. Neighbor is a person who is living next to another person at any given moment. So naturally, you have your static neighbor, the family that lives next to your house, to the left or to the right. Yeah, they're neighbors. But our neighbors change all day long. There's the definition. A person living next to another person at a given moment in time. So all day long, we're changing neighbors. We get new neighbors. Right now, as you're sitting there in church, the person to the left or right of you, that might be your family member, that's your neighbor. But the person in front of you and back of you, you're all living right now at the same time in this given moment. Those are your neighbors for right now. And those neighbors are going to change. Next week when you come to Mass, you'll have a new set of Mass neighbors. So for just a moment, look around you and say, howdy, neighbor. Look at your neighbor. Say hi to your neighbor. Look behind you and look in front of you. Hi, neighbor. And the big question is, when you look at your neighbor, how do you want your neighbor, that person in front of you and back of you, how do you want them to treat you? With kindness and respect and compassion. Who is our neighbor? You know, that's a powerful question that Jesus asked. And who is our neighbor? When you're down at John Eagle over Community Market, you're going down the grocery aisle and you're pushing your cart. You're going down one side and someone else is coming up the other side. Complete stranger. You don't know that person. You don't have to. But as you parallel each other in the aisleway for that very moment of time, a fleeting moment, that person becomes your neighbor because you're living side by side to each other. So how do you want to treat that neighbor that's going to be passing? A neighbor you're going to only have for a second or two. You want to say hi. Give that person a nod. Isn't that nice when a complete stranger says hi? Nowadays, for some reason, we seem reticent to say hi to our neighbors. And again, we're not necessarily talking about the neighbor to the left and right of your house, but everyone that you encounter all day long is your neighbor. When you're standing in line at the grocery store, at McDonald's, at Arby's, at Wendy's, at Villa Blanca, wherever you're at, and you're standing there and there are strangers next to you, guess who those people are? They're your neighbor. For that minute, for that 2 minutes, for that 5-minute wait, that person right next to you, complete stranger, that's your neighbor. You're living right next to another person at a given moment. That's your neighbor. How should you treat your neighbor? Say hi. Hi, neighbor. They might think you're a little whacked, but you're going to say, hi, neighbor. That's your neighbor. How do we make this world a better place to live in? A kinder, gentler place. A place that shares more smiles than frowns. A place that shares more kindness than cruelty. By treating our neighbor, Jesus Christ says, with compassion. Treat your neighbor with a nod, with a smile, with nice, kind words. Because they're a fleeting neighbor, and they're not going to be your neighbor long. Their line's going to eventually go down. You're going to get called to your table. And when you get to your table, the tables around you, you'll have new sets of neighbors. And as you sit at your table, look and say, hi, good evening. Say something nice to your neighbor. That's how we make this a better world to live. Who is your neighbor? The person that is next to you at any given moment during the course of the day. Our neighbors change all day long. We have a new neighbor. But if you want to make this a kinder, more beautiful world, it's already very, very beautiful. But for people to love each other more than they do now, treat your neighbors, as Jesus Christ says, with compassion, with respect, with kindness, with a smile, with generosity. For who is our neighbor? The person right next to you. I would ask the family of Olivia